Welcome, curious minds, to Beyond Midnight. If you haven't already, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our ever-growing community as we delve into the shadows of history, science, and the unexplained. Tonight, we journey back to an age of myth and steel, to a time when the longships of the North struck fear into the hearts of kingdoms. We speak, of course, of the Vikings. When you conjure an image of a Viking warrior, what comes to mind? Likely, it's a fearsome figure wielding a massive axe, perhaps a gleaming sword, or maybe a round shield adorned with a raven. These are the iconic symbols, etched into our collective imagination by sagas, archaeological finds, and popular culture. And for good reason. The Dane axe was a truly terrifying instrument of war, the Ulfbert sword a marvel of ancient metallurgy. But what if I told you that the true arsenal of the Viking warrior was far more diverse, far more cunning, and in many ways far deadlier than these celebrated few? What if the weapons that truly defined their brutal efficiency, the tools that often turn the tide of battle, are the very ones you've never heard of? Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth and popular misconception to uncover the unsung heroes of Viking Age combat. We're going beyond the broadsword and the battle axe, into the gritty, often overlooked implements that made the Vikings such formidable and feared adversaries. These aren't just obscure historical footnotes. These are the weapons that armed the common raider, the cunning strategist, and the desperate defender. They are the instruments of a warrior culture that valued pragmatism, versatility, and sheer, brutal effectiveness above all else. Prepare to have your understanding of Viking warfare fundamentally reshaped as we explore the deadliest Viking weapons you've never heard of. Let's begin not with a flash of steel, but with a simple, unassuming piece of wood and iron, the spear, or spjot in Old Norse. In the popular imagination, the spear is often relegated to the role of a secondary weapon, perhaps wielded by a common foot soldier while the chieftain brandishes his mighty sword. Yet, archaeological evidence, alongside the rich tapestry of the sagas, paints a very different picture. The spear was, without question, the most common and arguably the most important weapon in the Viking arsenal. It was ubiquitous, affordable, and incredibly versatile, making it the backbone of any Viking warband. Why is the spear so often overlooked? Perhaps it lacks the romantic allure of a finely crafted sword, or the raw, visceral power of a heavy axe, but its simplicity belied its lethality. A Viking Age spear consisted of a leaf-shaped or angular iron head, socketed onto a wooden shaft that could range from 6 to 10 feet in length, sometimes even longer. The sheer number of spearheads recovered from graves, battle sites, and hordes across Scandinavia, and the lands the Vikings raided speaks volumes. For every sword found, there are often dozens, if not hundreds, of spearheads. This wasn't merely a weapon of the poor. It was the weapon of choice for skilled warriors, chieftains, and even kings. The versatility of the spear was its greatest strength. It could be used for thrusting, keeping an enemy at bay, creating a formidable barrier in a shield wall formation. Imagine a phalanx of Viking warriors, their shields locked together, a bristling hedge of spear points extending outwards, forming an impenetrable wall of iron and wood. This was the fundamental tactic of Viking warfare, and the spear was its primary component. But the spear was not just a defensive weapon, it was a potent offensive tool. Lighter spears, often referred to as javelins or casta espijot, were designed for throwing. These could be hurled with surprising accuracy and force, disrupting enemy formations before a charge, picking off individual targets, or softening up a shield wall. The sagas are replete with instances of warriors throwing spears, often with deadly precision, striking down foes at a distance. But the Vikings, ever pragmatic in their approach to warfare, didn't just have one type of spear. They developed specialized spearheads, each designed for a specific purpose, and these are where we truly begin to uncover the deadliest weapons you've never heard of. Consider the barbed spear. While many spearheads were simple leaf shapes, others featured prominent barbs, sometimes even multiple sets of them. These weren't just for show. A barbed spear, once it penetrated flesh, was designed to inflict maximum damage upon withdrawal. The barbs would tear and rip, making extraction agonizingly painful and exacerbating the wound. In an age before advanced medical care, such a wound was often a death sentence, leading to massive blood loss, infection, and prolonged suffering. It was a weapon designed not just to kill, but to maim and incapacitate, to inspire terror in those who faced it. Imagine the sheer horror of being struck by such a weapon, knowing that every movement, every attempt to remove it, would only worsen your agony. Then there were the winged spears, sometimes called flanged spears. These spearheads featured two protrusions, or wings, extending from the base of the blade just above the socket. These wings served several crucial functions. Firstly, they prevented the spear from penetrating too deeply into a target, allowing for quicker retrieval in the heat of battle. This was especially important when fighting in a shield wall, where a deeply embedded spear could leave a warrior vulnerable. Secondly, and perhaps more cunningly, these wings could be used to hook an opponent's shield, pulling it aside to create an opening for a follow-up attack, or even to trip an enemy. They could also be used to parry or deflect an incoming blow, turning a defensive maneuver into an offensive opportunity. The winged spear transformed the simple spear into a more sophisticated tool for close-quarters combat, offering control and tactical advantages beyond a mere thrust. Archaeological finds from sites like Birka and Hedeby have yielded a rich variety of spearheads, showcasing this incredible diversity. Some were slender and light, clearly designed for throwing. Others were broad and heavy, meant for powerful thrusts. The shafts themselves were often made of ash or oak, sometimes reinforced with metal bands to prevent splitting. The sheer ubiquity and variety of these spears underscore their importance. They were the first line of attack, the last line of defense, and a constant, deadly threat on any battlefield. The spear's efficacy was also amplified by its reach. It allowed a warrior to engage an opponent from a safer distance, providing a crucial advantage in single combat or massed formations. It was a weapon that required skill and training, not just brute force. A well-trained spearman could feint, thrust, parry, and withdraw with incredible speed and precision, making them a truly formidable adversary. So the next time you picture a Viking warrior, remember the espijot, not just as a humble weapon, but as a meticulously designed, highly versatile and utterly devastating instrument of war, the true unsung hero of the Viking Age battlefield. It was a weapon that instilled fear, shaped tactics, and claimed countless lives, yet remains largely forgotten in the shadow of its more glamorous counterparts. Moving from the reach of the spear to the intimacy of close-quarters combat, we uncover another often overlooked weapon that was absolutely vital to the Viking warrior: the seax or scramasax. While swords get all the glory and axes all the terrifying renown, the seax was the constant companion of virtually every Viking man, whether he was a farmer, a trader, or a full-fledged raider. It was a tool for everyday life, but in the brutal world of the Viking Age, any tool could become a weapon, and the seax was a particularly deadly one. The seax was essentially a large, single-edged knife, typically ranging from 6 inches to over 2 feet in length. Its most distinctive feature was its thick spine and often a broken back profile, where the back of the blade angled sharply down towards the tip. This design gave it immense cutting power and a robust, sturdy construction. Unlike a double-edged sword, the seax was designed primarily for chopping and slashing, making it incredibly effective in a chaotic melee. Archaeological evidence for the seax is overwhelming. Thousands have been found across Scandinavia, England, and continental Europe in graves, settlements, and river finds. This widespread distribution speaks to its universal adoption. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an essential piece of equipment carried by rich and poor alike. There were several types of seaxes, each with slightly different purposes. The smaller ones, often called utility seaxes, were indeed used for daily tasks: cutting rope, preparing food, carving wood, skinning animals. But even these short blades, measuring around 6 to 12 inches, could be devastating in a close-quarters fight, used for stabbing or slashing vital arteries. Imagine a warrior having lost his primary weapon, drawing a short, heavy seax for a desperate, brutal struggle. Then there were the medium and long seaxes, often referred to as fighting seaxes or even short swords. These could range from 12 inches up to 2 feet or more, blurring the line between a knife and a short sword. These were clearly designed with combat in mind. Their robust construction meant they could stand up to heavy use, and their sharp, single edge could inflict terrible wounds. The broken back profile, in particular, concentrated force at the tip, making it excellent for piercing or delivering powerful, hacking blows. Why was the seax so deadly and so critical, yet so often ignored in popular depictions? Firstly, its accessibility. While a high-quality sword was a significant investment, a seax was far more affordable and easier to produce. This meant every warrior, regardless of status, could carry one. Secondly, its practicality. It was a weapon that could be carried discreetly, always at hand, ready for any situation. In a surprise attack, a sudden ambush, or a desperate struggle after a primary weapon was lost or broken, the seax was the ultimate backup. In the chaotic press of a shield wall, where space was limited and large weapons could be cumbersome, the seax truly shone. It could be drawn quickly, used for rapid, brutal thrusts or slashes into an opponent's unarmored limbs or neck. It was a weapon for the desperate, the cunning, and the utterly ruthless. It didn't require the same elaborate footwork or fencing skill as a sword. It was a weapon of raw, visceral, infighting brutality. The psychological impact of the Sikhs should not be underestimated either. It was a personal weapon, used in the most intimate and savage forms of combat. To be cut or stabbed by a Sikh was not merely to be wounded. It was to be subjected to a brutal, often disfiguring attack. The thick blade, designed for heavy cutting, could sever limbs, open arteries, and inflict wounds that were difficult to treat and often fatal. The sagas, while often glorifying swords and axes, also occasionally mention the Sikhs. For example, in Egil's saga, Egil Skallagrimson is depicted using various weapons, and while swords and axes are prominent, the use of smaller, more versatile blades for specific situations would have been commonplace. These were not weapons for grand, heroic duels, but for the grim reality of survival on the battlefield or in a sudden skirmish. So the seax in its various forms was not merely a utility knife. It was a versatile, robust, and incredibly deadly weapon that was always at a Viking warrior's side. It represents the pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to warfare that defined the Vikings. It was the weapon of last resort, the silent killer, and an indispensable part of their deadly arsenal. Yet it remains largely a mystery to those outside the realm of dedicated historical study. From the close-quarters brutality of the Sikhs, we now turn our attention to a weapon system that is perhaps the most egregiously overlooked in the popular narrative of Viking warfare: the bow and arrow, or bogi og urvar. When we think of archers, our minds often drift to English longbowmen, or perhaps the mounted archers of the steppe. But the Vikings were accomplished archers, and the bow played a far more significant role in their military tactics than is commonly acknowledged. The popular image of a Viking rarely includes a bow, yet archaeological evidence tells a compelling story. Numerous bows and arrowheads have been recovered from Viking Age sites. Perhaps the most famous examples come from the Gokstad ship burial, where a fully preserved bow, nearly 2 meters long, and dozens of arrows were found. Similar finds have been made in Hedeby, Birka, and other settlements, indicating that archery was a widespread and valued skill. Viking bows were typically self-bows, crafted from a single piece of wood, most commonly yew, ash, or elm. They were powerful weapons, capable of launching arrows with considerable force and accuracy. The arrows themselves were made of wood, fletched with feathers, and tipped with a variety of iron arrowheads, each designed for a specific purpose. This diversity of arrowheads is another indicator of the bow's tactical importance. Bodkin points were slender, armor-piercing heads designed to punch through mail shirts or thick leather armor. Broadheads were wider, leaf-shaped or barbed, designed to create large, gaping wounds and cause maximum bleeding in unarmored targets. These were particularly devastating against exposed flesh. Other, simpler points were used for hunting or skirmishing. Why is the bow and arrow so often never heard of in the context of Viking warfare? Perhaps it's the emphasis on their close-quarters combat prowess, their terrifying charges with axes and swords. But the reality is, the bow was essential for several key aspects of Viking military operations. Firstly, naval warfare. The Vikings were masters of the sea, and many of their battles took place on or around their longships. Archers positioned on the decks of longships could unleash volleys of arrows onto enemy vessels, suppressing defenders, picking off helmsmen or key warriors, and softening up the opposition before boarding actions. The confined space of a ship deck made archery a highly effective weapon, allowing warriors to engage foes from a distance without exposing themselves to immediate melee. Secondly, siege warfare and skirmishing. When attacking fortified settlements, archers could provide covering fire, harassing defenders on walls, and creating a diversion while other warriors attempted to breach gates or scale defenses. In skirmishes and ambushes, particularly in forested or broken terrain, archers could inflict casualties from concealment, disrupting enemy formations and sowing chaos before a melee charge. The element of surprise, combined with a hail of arrows, could be psychologically devastating. Thirdly, hunting. While not directly a weapon of war, the skills developed through hunting with a bow translated directly to combat. A Viking warrior who was an accomplished hunter would naturally be a skilled archer, capable of hitting moving targets and estimating distances. Archery was a fundamental skill for survival, and thus, a fundamental skill for warfare. The sagas, while not always highlighting archery as much as swordsmanship, do contain references to archers and their effectiveness. Egil's saga mentions archers, and the Battle of Esvalder, a famous naval battle, likely involved significant use of bows and arrows from ship to ship. The Bayeux Tapestry, while depicting Norman and Anglo-Saxon warfare, shows the widespread use of bows in that period, and the Vikings would have been no exception. The sheer volume of arrows that could be loosed in a short period could be truly terrifying. Imagine a Viking raid on an unsuspecting village or monastery. A volley of arrows, appearing seemingly from nowhere, could sow panic and confusion, allowing the raiders to close in with their melee weapons. Against a disciplined shield wall, sustained archery fire could weaken the formation, injure key warriors, and create openings for a brutal charge. The bow and arrow, therefore, was not a secondary or niche weapon. It was an integral part of the Viking tactical repertoire, providing ranged support, initiating engagements, and proving particularly deadly in the unique environment of naval combat. Its absence from many popular depictions is a significant oversight, denying us a full understanding of the cunning and versatility that characterized Viking warfare. It was a weapon that allowed them to project their power from a distance, to soften up their enemies before the terrifying clash of steel, and to inflict casualties without immediate risk, making it one of the deadliest, yet most unsung, tools in their arsenal. From the sophisticated simplicity of the bow, we now descend even further into the realm of the truly humble, yet surprisingly deadly, the sling or slingva. When you think of ancient warfare, slings might bring to mind David and Goliath, or perhaps Roman auxiliary troops. They are rarely, if ever, associated with the Vikings. And yet, there is compelling evidence to suggest that slings were indeed part of the Viking warrior's arsenal, making them perhaps the ultimate weapon you've never heard of in this context. The primary reason for their obscurity is the lack of direct archaeological finds. Slings, being made of perishable materials like leather, wool, or linen, rarely survive the passage of 1,000 years. However, what does survive are the projectiles, sling stones. While it can be difficult to definitively identify a stone as a sling projectile rather than a natural rock, specific types of stones, rounded, uniformly sized, and sometimes even manufactured from clay or lead, have been found at Viking Age sites that strongly suggest their use with slings. Why would the Vikings, masters of steel and shipbuilding, bother with such a primitive weapon? The answer lies in their pragmatic approach to warfare. Slings were incredibly cheap, easy to make, and required no precious metal. They were accessible to everyone, from the lowliest thrall to the mightiest jarl, and despite their simplicity, they were surprisingly effective. A skilled slinger could hurl a stone projectile at incredible speeds. Estimates suggest upwards of 100 miles per hour, and with considerable accuracy over significant distances, sometimes exceeding that of a bow. The impact of a lead or dense stone projectile, even a relatively small one, could be devastating. It wouldn't necessarily penetrate armor, but a direct hit to the head could cause a concussion, a fractured skull, or even immediate death. Hits to limbs could break bones, making a warrior incapacitated. Imagine a hail of these projectiles raining down on an enemy formation, causing chaos, pain, and demoralization before the main Viking charge. The tactical applications of slings were numerous. Naval engagements. Just like bows, slings could be used from the decks of longships to harass enemy vessels, targeting rowers, helmsmen, and exposed warriors. The sheer volume of projectiles that could be launched by multiple slingers made them a potent force in ship-to-ship combat. Siege warfare. Slingers could be positioned to suppress defenders on walls, forcing them to take cover and creating opportunities for scaling ladders or breaching gates. Skirmishes and ambushes. In open terrain or during quick raids, slings could provide an initial barrage, disrupting enemy formations and allowing the Vikings to close the distance with their melee weapons. Cost-effectiveness. In an age where metal was precious, slings offered a way to arm a large number of combatants with effective ranged weapons without significant expense. Any village could quickly muster a force of slingers using readily available materials. The sagas, while not explicitly detailing sling use, do mention instances of stone throwing in battles, and it's highly probable that many of these instances involved slings rather than simply throwing rocks by hand, which would be far less effective. The sheer power and range of a sling made it a superior choice for projectile combat where bows might be scarce or less suitable. The reason the sling remains so deeply never heard of in the Viking context is likely due to its humble nature. It wasn't a weapon of status or craftsmanship. It left no grand archaeological remains like a sword or an axe. It was simply a tool, an effective one, wielded by common folk and warriors alike, a testament to the Viking ingenuity and their willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory. It reminds us that Viking warfare wasn't always about glorious individual combat. It was often about brutal, pragmatic efficiency, and the sling, despite its unassuming appearance, was a surprisingly deadly instrument in that pursuit. Next, we turn our attention to a weapon that often gets conflated with its larger, more famous cousins, but deserves recognition in its own right: the hand axe and the dedicated throwing axe, or castox. When most people think of a Viking axe, they picture the massive, two-handed Dane axe, capable of cleaving shields and men in two. While that image is certainly valid and terrifying, it overshadows the far more common and versatile smaller axes that were an indispensable part of a Viking warrior's kit. The hand axe was first and foremost a tool. It was used for felling trees, splitting wood, building, and countless other daily tasks. But in the hands of a Viking, any tool could become a weapon, and the hand axe was exceptionally well suited for this dual role. These axes were smaller, lighter, and designed for one-handed use, often weighing between 1 to 3 pounds. Their handles were shorter, allowing for greater maneuverability and speed in combat. Archaeological finds confirm the widespread use of these smaller axes. Graves and settlement sites have yielded numerous examples of axe heads that are clearly not the massive battle axes, but rather robust, functional hand axes. These were the axes carried by the common man, always at his belt, ready for both work and war. In combat, the hand axe offered several distinct advantages. Speed and agility. Lighter than a sword or a large battle axe, it could be swung rapidly, allowing for quick strikes and parries. Versatility. It could be used for chopping, hooking, or even as a bludgeon with the pole, the blunt back of the axe head. Close quarters combat. In the tight confines of a shield wall or a ship's deck, a smaller axe was often more practical than a long, unwieldy weapon. It could be wielded effectively in situations where a large axe would be cumbersome. Backup weapon. Much like the seaxes, a hand axe served as an excellent secondary weapon, to be drawn if a primary weapon was lost or damaged. But beyond the general hand axe, there was also a more specialized variant, the throwing axe or castox. While any small axe could theoretically be thrown, some axe heads appear to be specifically designed for this purpose. These might have been lighter, with a balance point optimized for rotation in flight, and perhaps even smaller, more aerodynamic profiles. The sagas occasionally mention warriors throwing axes, sometimes with deadly accuracy. Egil's saga, for instance, describes Egil Skallagrimsson throwing an axe at an opponent, a testament to the skill and the weapon's effectiveness. The throwing axe served as a crucial ranged weapon, albeit one with a shorter range than a bow or sling. It could be hurled during the initial moments of a charge, disrupting an enemy's formation, or as a desperate last resort. Imagine a warrior, closing the distance, unleashing a spinning axe towards an opponent's face or shield, forcing them to react, creating an opening for a follow-up melee attack. It was a weapon of psychological impact as well as physical damage. The sight of a spinning axe hurtling towards you being enough to break concentration and instill fear. The hand axe and throwing axe are never heard of in the same breath as the Dane axe because they lack the same dramatic flair. They are practical, utilitarian weapons, often overshadowed by the more specialized and visually impressive instruments of war. Yet, their ubiquity, versatility, and sheer effectiveness made them indispensable to the Viking warrior. They were the tools that built their ships and homes, and the weapons that helped them conquer and defend. They represent the gritty reality of Viking combat, where ingenuity and resourcefulness were just as important as brute strength, and where even the most common tool could be transformed into a deadly instrument of war. As we delve deeper into the Viking warrior's arsenal, we uncover how even defensive items could be weaponized. Our next deadliest weapon you've never heard of isn't a standalone piece of offensive equipment, but rather a crucial component of the ubiquitous Viking shield, the shield boss, or Eskjaldarhorn. The Viking shield, typically round and made of wooden planks, was primarily a defensive item, designed to protect the warrior from blows. However, at its center lay the shield boss, a hemispherical or conical iron dome that covered the hand grip. This boss was not just for protection. It was a potent offensive weapon in its own right, especially in the brutal, close-quarters fighting that characterized Viking combat. Imagine a Viking warrior locked in a shield wall or engaged in a chaotic melee. Space is limited, and the ability to wield a large sword or axe effectively is often hampered. In such situations, the shield itself, and particularly its iron boss, became an extension of the warrior's offensive capabilities. The primary use of the shield boss as a weapon was for punching and smashing. A warrior could deliver a powerful punch with the shield, driving the iron boss directly into an opponent's face, chest, or groin. Such a blow could easily break bones, cause concussions, or inflict severe internal injuries. It was a brutal, direct form of attack, requiring little wind-up and delivering maximum impact in confined spaces. The sagas, while not always detailing the precise use of the shield boss, often describe warriors shield bashing, or pushing with shields, and these actions would invariably involve the boss as the primary point of impact. Beyond direct impact, the shield boss could also be used for hooking and parrying. The curved surface of the boss, combined with the edge of the shield, could be used to hook an opponent's shield, pulling it aside to create an opening for a follow-up strike with a sword or axe. It could also be used to deflect or parry an incoming blow, turning aside a sword thrust or an axe swing, and then immediately following up with an offensive shield bash. The shield itself, even without focusing solely on the boss, was a formidable weapon. Warriors would use their shields to push and shove in the shield wall, creating openings or disrupting enemy formations. The weight and momentum of a shield could knock an opponent off balance, creating a crucial moment of vulnerability. It was a weapon of control, disruption, and brutal physical force. The reason the shield boss as an offensive weapon is never heard of by most is that it's often seen as a passive, defensive component. We tend to focus on the glamour of the blade or the power of the axe. But the Viking warrior was nothing if not pragmatic, and they understood that every part of their equipment could be pressed into offensive service. The shield boss represents the raw, visceral reality of Viking combat, a brutal, no-holds-barred struggle where every advantage, no matter how small, was exploited. It speaks to a warrior culture where combat was often a messy, chaotic affair, not a series of elegant duels. In the grind of a shield wall where warriors were shoulder to shoulder, the ability to deliver a devastating blow with an ironclad fist, encased within the shield boss, could be the difference between life and death. It wasn't just about defense. It was about aggressive defense, turning protection into an opportunity for attack. The shield boss, therefore, stands as a testament to the Viking warriors' ingenuity and their relentless pursuit of victory through any means necessary, making it a truly deadly, yet often overlooked, element of their formidable arsenal. From the specialized uses of common items, we now venture into the realm of the truly improvisational, revealing the Viking warrior's ultimate weapon you've never heard of: anything and everything. This isn't a single weapon, but rather a mindset, a brutal pragmatism that understood that in the heat of battle or the desperation of a raid, the environment itself, and any object within it, could be turned into a lethal instrument. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were survivors, explorers, and resourceful craftsmen. This resourcefulness extended directly to their approach to combat. When a primary weapon was lost or broken, or when circumstances called for an unconventional approach, the Viking warrior would not hesitate to improvise. Consider the farming tools: a scythe, a pitchfork, a shovel in the hands of a desperate warrior. These everyday implements could become surprisingly effective weapons. A scythe with its long, curved blade could be swung with devastating effect, capable of disemboweling an opponent or severing limbs. A pitchfork with its sharp tines could be used for thrusting, keeping an enemy at bay, or even pinning them against a wall. A sturdy shovel, while blunt, could deliver bone-shattering blows, or be used to scoop and throw dirt or sand into an opponent's eyes, blinding them temporarily and creating a critical opening. These were not weapons of choice, but weapons of necessity, wielded by farmers defending their homes or warriors caught unawares, and they underscore the brutal reality that any object could be repurposed for violence. Then there are the maritime tools and ship components. The Vikings spent much of their lives on their longships, and these vessels were not just transport. They were mobile fortresses and battle platforms. Oars, for example, were long, heavy, and made of sturdy wood. In a ship-to-ship boarding action or a chaotic melee on deck, an oar could be swung like a club, delivering powerful, crushing blows. The heavy, reinforced prow of a longship, while not a weapon wielded by hand, was used as a battering ram against other ships or coastal defenses. Even the ropes and rigging could be used to entangle, trip, or even strangle an opponent in the close confines of a ship. The anchor, a massive piece of iron, could be dropped onto enemy vessels or used as an improvised bludgeon if somehow detached. The very environment of their primary mode of transport was ripe for weaponization. Consider also the domestic and craft tools. A heavy hammer, used for forging or carpentry, could become a skull-crushing weapon. A sharp chisel, designed for intricate carving, could be plunged into an opponent's vital organs. Even the humble cooking knife, larger and sturdier than many modern counterparts, could become a deadly blade in a desperate struggle. These were not weapons designed for war, but their robust construction and sharp edges made them lethal in the hands of someone fighting for their life. The Viking mindset was one of constant readiness and brutal practicality. They lived in a harsh world where survival often depended on their ability to adapt and improvise. This meant looking at their surroundings with a warrior's eye, always assessing potential threats and opportunities. If a warrior was disarmed or found himself in a situation where his primary weapons were unsuitable, he would not hesitate to grab a broken branch, a heavy stone, or even a piece of timber from a collapsing building. The sagas, while focusing on named weapons and heroic deeds, also subtly hint at this improvisational spirit. Characters are often described as grabbing whatever was at hand in a moment of crisis. The sheer brutality of some descriptions suggests that combat was not always a formalized affair, but a desperate struggle where all bets were off. The use of rocks and stones, mentioned earlier in the context of slings, could also be done by hand, especially in a desperate close-quarters struggle where a warrior might pick up a heavy stone from the ground and hurl it or use it as a blunt instrument. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who is willing to use anything and everything as a weapon is also profound. It speaks to a relentless, unyielding spirit, a foe who will not give up, and who will employ the most brutal and unconventional means to achieve victory. It shatters any illusion of chivalry or formalized combat, revealing the raw, savage heart of Viking warfare. So when we talk about the deadliest Viking weapons you've never heard of, it's not just about specific named artifacts. It's about understanding the deep-seated pragmatism and resourcefulness that allowed a Viking warrior to turn a simple farming tool, a piece of ship rigging, or even a heavy stone into an instrument of death. This adaptability, this willingness to weaponize the mundane, was perhaps their most formidable and least understood advantage, a testament to their unwavering will to survive and conquer. Let's delve deeper into the often overlooked, yet incredibly impactful realm of traps and battlefield modifications. While not weapons in the traditional sense, these elements were crucial to Viking strategy and could inflict devastating casualties, often before direct combat even began. The Vikings, masters of raiding and conquest, understood the importance of shaping the battlefield to their advantage, employing cunning and guile alongside brute force. One of the most effective, yet rarely discussed, weapons in their arsenal was the pitfall trap, often camouflaged and sometimes lined with sharpened stakes. While archaeological evidence for these is difficult to pinpoint directly to the Viking age, historical accounts and the general understanding of ancient warfare suggest their widespread use. Imagine a raiding party advancing on a village, only to have their leading warriors plummet into a hidden pit, impaled on sharpened wooden spikes. This not only inflicted casualties, but also caused immense panic and disruption, breaking the momentum of an attack or defense. These traps were particularly effective in forested areas, narrow passes, or around the perimeter of a defended settlement. Closely related were caltrops, or jarnbroth iron bread as they might have been called in later periods, though the concept is ancient. These were simple devices, often made of iron, with multiple spikes arranged so that at least one point always faced upwards. Scattered on paths, beaches, or choke points, caltrops were designed to injure the feet of advancing infantry or cavalry. Against unarmored feet, they could cause debilitating wounds, leading to infection and slowing down an entire force. Against a barefoot or lightly shod opponent, they were a truly cruel and effective deterrent. While direct Viking Age caltrop finds are rare, the principle was well understood in ancient warfare, and it is highly probable that the pragmatic Vikings would have employed such simple, effective devices. The Vikings also excelled at ambushes and creating choke points using the natural terrain. While not a weapon per se, modifying the environment to channel enemies into kill zones was a deadly tactic. Felling trees to block paths, creating artificial bottlenecks, or leading enemies into swamps or boggy ground where their heavier armor would become a liability. These were all forms of environmental weaponization. They understood the terrain, whether it was the rocky coastlines of Scandinavia or the dense forests of Anglo-Saxon England, and they used it to their advantage. A narrow fjord could become a killing field for enemy ships, and a dense forest could conceal an entire warband ready to spring an ambush. Another significant weapon was fire. While fire was used extensively in sieges and raids to destroy buildings, it was also employed tactically. Burning arrows could be shot into thatched roofs to set buildings ablaze, creating chaos and forcing defenders out into the open. Flaming brands could be thrown into enemy formations, not just to burn, but to disorient and spread panic. Imagine the psychological terror of facing a Viking charge while your village burns behind you, smoke filling the air, and the heat of the flames adding to the oppressive atmosphere of battle. Fire was a weapon of destruction, but also a weapon of psychological warfare, sowing fear and despair. Even the weather and tides could be weaponized. The Vikings were master seafarers, intimately familiar with the unpredictable nature of the northern seas. They often planned their raids and naval engagements to coincide with favorable winds, tides, or storm fronts, using the elements to their advantage and catching their enemies unprepared. A sudden storm could scatter an enemy fleet, leaving them vulnerable to a Viking attack, or a strong current could allow a longship to outmaneuver a heavier, slower vessel. While not a weapon they wielded, their understanding and exploitation of these natural forces gave them a deadly edge. The reason these weapons are often overlooked is that they don't fit the traditional image of a warrior holding a blade. They are subtle, strategic, and often leave no direct archaeological trace, but they were absolutely integral to the Viking way of war. They speak to a culture that valued cunning and tactical brilliance as much as individual prowess. The ability to manipulate the environment, to lay traps, and to exploit natural forces allowed the Vikings to multiply their strength, to inflict casualties with minimal risk, and to demoralize their opponents before the real fighting even began. These were the unseen, unheard-of weapons that often set the stage for their most brutal victories. Let's turn our attention now to a weapon that, while known, is often underestimated in its Viking form and versatility: the war club or bludgeon, and specifically the gavel-headed club or cudgel. When one thinks of Viking weapons, the image of refined steel usually dominates. However, the club in various forms was a ubiquitous and highly effective weapon, especially for those who couldn't afford metal weapons, or in situations where blunt force trauma was preferred or more effective. The simplest form of a club is just a heavy piece of wood, perhaps a broken branch or a sturdy piece of timber. These were readily available, required no specialized craftsmanship, and could deliver skull-shattering blows. They were the ultimate poor man's weapon, but no less deadly for it. In a surprise attack, a desperate defense, or a chaotic melee, a heavy club could quickly incapacitate an opponent. However, the Vikings also utilized more sophisticated forms of clubs. One particularly interesting and often overlooked variant is the gavel-headed club. While not as common in archaeological finds as axes or swords, the concept of a weighted club with a distinct striking head is ancient and universal. Some archaeological evidence, often interpreted as tools, could easily have served as weapons. These clubs would have a heavy, often squared or rounded head, sometimes reinforced with metal bands or studs, attached to a sturdy wooden shaft. Why would a Viking warrior choose a club over a blade? Cost-effectiveness. As mentioned, wood was free and abundant, unlike iron or steel. This made clubs accessible to everyone. Blunt force trauma. Against lightly armored opponents, or even those wearing mail, a heavy blunt weapon could be incredibly effective. A sword might glance off mail, but a club could deliver crushing blows that would break bones, cause internal bleeding, or induce concussions, even if the armor remained intact. A direct hit to the head, even through a helmet, could be fatal. Training. While a degree of skill is always beneficial, a club requires less specialized training to wield effectively than a sword or spear. Its basic function is intuitive. Swing it hard. Non-lethal, relatively. In some situations, a warrior might want to incapacitate an opponent rather than kill them outright, perhaps for capture or ransom. A well-aimed club blow could achieve this, though the line between incapacitation and death was often very thin. Confined spaces. Similar to the seax and hand axe, a shorter, heavy club could be very effective in the close quarters of a ship or a crowded battle. The psychological impact of a club should also not be underestimated. The raw, visceral sound of a heavy club connecting with bone or shield could be terrifying. It's a weapon of brute force, symbolizing a primal form of combat. While the sagas are replete with descriptions of swords and axes, the presence of clubs and bludgeons in Viking Age combat is often inferred rather than explicitly detailed. However, the universality of such weapons across cultures and time periods, combined with the pragmatic nature of Viking warfare, makes their widespread use highly probable. A farmer defending his homestead, a thrall pressed into service, or even a seasoned warrior disarmed in battle would have readily turned to a club as a potent means of defense or attack. The club, in its various forms, represents another facet of the Viking warrior's adaptability and their willingness to use any available means to achieve victory. It reminds us that Viking warfare was not always about elegant blades and heroic duels. It was often about brutal, pragmatic, and utterly devastating blunt force, delivered by a weapon that is often overlooked, but was undoubtedly one of the deadliest in their arsenal. Continuing our exploration of the unsung heroes of Viking Age combat, we now turn to a weapon that is often dismissed as purely ceremonial or confined to specific, non-combat roles, yet held significant lethal potential: the spear axe or bearded axe with an extended haft. While the Dane axe is famously large, and hand axes are common, there existed a fascinating hybrid that blurred the lines between an axe and a spear, offering unique tactical advantages that are rarely appreciated. This spear axe wasn't a standardized weapon with a specific Old Norse name that has survived distinctively. Rather, it represents a category of axes, particularly those with a very long, downward-curving beard, the lower part of the blade extending below the haft, combined with an unusually long wooden handle, sometimes approaching the length of a short spear. Archaeological finds, particularly from graves across Scandinavia and Viking settlements, show a variety of axe heads that could fit this description. Some with exceptionally long beards, others with more pronounced points at the top of the blade, and many clearly mounted on hafts longer than a typical hand axe. The key to its deadliness lay in its hybrid functionality. Extended reach and hooking. The long haft allowed for greater reach than a standard axe, enabling a warrior to engage opponents from a safer distance, similar to a spear. The long beard of the axe was not just for cutting, it was excellent for hooking. A warrior could hook an opponent's shield, pulling it away to expose the warrior behind it, or hook an opponent's leg, tripping them in the chaos of battle. This hooking ability was a subtle but incredibly effective tactical maneuver, allowing a skilled warrior to disrupt formations and create openings. Piercing and thrusting. While primarily an axe, some designs had a more pointed top edge, allowing for effective thrusting attacks, much like a spear. This made it a versatile weapon that could be swung for powerful cuts, but also thrust for piercing attacks, offering a warrior options in different combat scenarios. Leverage and power. The longer haft provided greater leverage, allowing for incredibly powerful swings. A well-aimed blow from a bearded axe on a long haft could cleave through armor and bone with terrifying force. Versatility in formations. In a shield wall, the extended reach could be used to strike over or around the shields of friendly warriors, engaging the enemy without exposing oneself too much. It offered a unique blend of offensive and defensive capabilities. Why is this weapon never heard of in its full deadly potential? Part of the reason is that it doesn't fit neatly into the categories of axe or spear. It's a nuanced weapon, a testament to the Viking craftsmen's and warriors' desire for optimal utility. Popular culture tends to simplify Viking weaponry into broad, iconic categories. The spear axe, or long-hafted bearded axe, represents a more sophisticated understanding of battlefield needs. The sagas might refer to such weapons simply as axes, without specifying the unique characteristics that made them so versatile. The nuance of a specific axe head design on a particular haft length is often lost in general descriptions. Yet, the archaeological record, with its diverse array of axe heads, clearly indicates that the Vikings experimented and optimized their designs for various combat roles. Imagine a warrior wielding such a weapon. He could keep an enemy at bay with its reach, then hook their shield, pull it aside, and deliver a devastating cut or thrust in one fluid motion. It was a weapon that required skill and precision, combining the best aspects of both the axe and the spear, making it a truly formidable and multifaceted instrument of war. Its ability to disrupt, pierce, and cut with extended reach made it a silent, yet incredibly deadly force on the Viking battlefield, deserving of far more recognition than it typically receives. Let's now pivot from the battlefield to the very core of Viking life and ritual, and explore another deadliest weapon you've never heard of in its full context: the sacrificial knife or ritual blade. While not a weapon of direct combat in the conventional sense, these blades played a crucial, albeit terrifying, role in the Viking worldview, inspiring fear and shaping the psychological landscape of their enemies. Their lethality was not just in the physical act of killing, but in the profound spiritual and cultural implications of their use. Archaeological finds, particularly from bog bodies and sacrificial sites, have revealed a variety of knives and blades that appear to have been used in ritual contexts. These can range from finely crafted, ornate blades to simpler, utilitarian knives, distinguished by the circumstances of their discovery and the context of their use. While some might argue these are merely specialized knives, their purpose and impact extended far beyond simple utility. The Vikings were deeply superstitious, and their religion, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, demanded sacrifice. These sacrifices could be animals, valuable objects, or, in some instances, human beings. The act of ritual killing performed with a specialized blade was not just about ending a life. It was about communion with the divine, appeasing powerful forces, or ensuring prosperity and victory. The deadliness of these blades wasn't just in their sharpness, but in the terror they inspired. Imagine being a captive, brought before a Viking chieftain, knowing that you might be offered as a sacrifice to Odin or Thor. The sight of a priest or jarl wielding a ritual blade, perhaps adorned with symbols, ready to spill blood in the name of their gods, would have been utterly terrifying. This wasn't just a threat of death. It was a threat of spiritual annihilation, of being consumed by foreign gods. This profound psychological impact on their enemies, particularly those from Christian lands, was a powerful tool of conquest and control. Furthermore, the concept of ritual killing permeated Viking society, even into their understanding of warfare. The sagas often speak of warriors being sacrificed to Odin in battle, or of blood eagles, a gruesome method of execution where the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and lungs pulled out to resemble wings. While the historical veracity of the blood eagle is debated, its mere existence in the lore speaks to a culture that understood and embraced ritualized violence as a form of devotion and terror. The blades used for such acts, whether real or symbolic, were imbued with a terrifying power. The very act of ritual sacrifice, performed with these specialized knives, reinforced the Vikings' belief in their own divine favor and superiority. It solidified their identity as a people chosen by powerful gods, willing to go to extreme lengths to honor them. This unwavering conviction, fueled by ritual and sacrifice, made them even more formidable in battle. These ritual blades are never heard of as weapons in the conventional sense because they weren't used to parry a sword or cleave a shield. Their lethality operated on a different plane, the psychological and spiritual. They were instruments of ultimate control, symbols of absolute power over life and death, wielded not just by warriors, but by priests and chieftains in acts of profound cultural significance. They were a testament to the Vikings' deep connection between warfare, religion, and the terrifying willingness to embrace ultimate violence, making them one of the deadliest, most insidious, and least understood weapons in their entire arsenal. Let's continue our journey into the shadows of Viking warfare, focusing on a weapon that is often overlooked due to its simplicity and the lack of spectacular archaeological finds, yet was undoubtedly a brutal and effective tool. The stone axe or stone hammer, sometimes hafted, sometimes wielded directly. While the Viking Age is defined by its iron and steel, the memory and utility of stone implements persisted, particularly in situations where metal was scarce or for specific, brutal applications. The popular image of the Stone Age warrior wielding a crude stone axe is far removed from the sophisticated ironmongery of the Vikings. However, it would be a mistake to assume that stone tools vanished entirely. In remote areas, among poorer communities, or for specific tasks, stone implements remained in use. Furthermore, in the heat of battle, a heavy, suitably shaped stone could be hafted onto a wooden handle to create a surprisingly effective axe or hammer. Archaeological evidence for hafted stone axes and hammers from the Viking Age is less abundant than for metal weapons, precisely because they were often improvised or considered less valuable, and thus less likely to be buried with a chieftain. However, unworked or minimally worked stones, clearly chosen for their weight and shape, are found at settlement sites and could easily have been pressed into service as weapons. The deadliness of the stone axe or hammer lay in its raw, unadulterated blunt force trauma. Skull-crushing power. A heavy stone head delivered with force could easily crush a skull, even through a simple leather cap or a light helmet. Unlike a sharp blade that could glance off, a blunt impact delivered immense shock to the brain. Bone-breaking blows. Hits to limbs or torso could shatter bones, cause severe internal bleeding, and incapacitate an opponent instantly. Accessibility. Stone was everywhere. In a pinch, any suitable heavy rock could become a weapon. This made it the ultimate improvised weapon for those who had nothing else, or for desperate situations. Cost-effectiveness. Zero cost. This meant that even the lowest-ranking members of society, or those defending their homes without access to metal weapons, could arm themselves. Consider a Viking raid on a remote settlement where metal was scarce. The defenders, perhaps farmers or fishermen, might not have had access to swords or axes. In such a scenario, hafted stone hammers or even just heavy stones wielded by hand would have been their primary means of defense. Against an unarmored or lightly armored opponent, these could be just as devastating as a metal weapon. The sheer primal nature of a stone weapon also carries a certain psychological weight. It's a return to the most basic, brutal form of combat. Facing an opponent wielding a heavy stone knowing the kind of crushing damage it could inflict would be profoundly unsettling. It speaks to a raw, unrefined violence that often characterized the desperate struggles of the Viking Age. These weapons are never heard of in the popular narrative because they lack the glamour and technological sophistication of metal. They are a reminder that Viking warfare was not always about finely crafted blades and heroic deeds. It was also about survival, desperation, and the ruthless exploitation of whatever resources were at hand. The stone axe or hammer, in its brutal simplicity and devastating effectiveness, stands as a testament to the harsh realities of Viking Age combat, a truly deadly weapon from a forgotten corner of their arsenal. Our journey through the deadliest, yet least known, Viking weapons now brings us to a surprisingly sophisticated and often overlooked category: poison and psychological warfare tools. While not physical weapons in the sense of being wielded in hand, these methods were incredibly effective, insidious, and deeply feared by the Vikings' enemies, making them profoundly deadly. They represent a cunning and ruthless side of Viking strategy that goes beyond brute force. The use of poison in warfare is difficult to prove definitively through archaeology, as organic substances rarely survive. However, historical accounts from the period, combined with a knowledge of natural toxins available in Scandinavia and the lands they raided, suggest its probable use. Poisoned arrows and spear tips, while not as widespread as in some other cultures, the possibility of dipping arrowheads or spear tips in animal venom, decaying matter, or plant toxins, like hemlock or monkshood, cannot be entirely dismissed. Even a non-lethal poison could cause severe illness, incapacitation, or infection, turning a minor wound into a death sentence. The psychological impact of knowing you might be struck by a poison projectile would be immense. Contaminated water sources. In siege situations or when raiding a settlement, contaminating wells or other water sources with decaying animal carcasses or poisonous plants could sicken or kill defenders without direct combat. This was a common tactic in ancient warfare, and the Vikings, ever pragmatic, would likely have employed it. Psychological impact. The mere rumor of poisoned weapons or water could spread panic and demoralization far more effectively than any physical attack. It eroded trust, fostered paranoia, and undermined the will to fight. Beyond physical poisons, the Vikings were masters of psychological warfare, employing tactics designed to break the enemy's spirit before battle even began. Terror and reputation. The Vikings cultivated a terrifying reputation. Their brutal raids, the destruction of monasteries, the enslavement of populations, and the sheer ferocity of their attacks were all carefully crafted or organically developed forms of psychological warfare. The mere sight of longships on the horizon, or the sound of their battle cries, was often enough to send entire communities fleeing. This pre-existing terror meant that battles were often won before a single blow was struck. Ritualized violence and gruesome displays. As discussed with sacrificial knives, the Vikings were not afraid to use gruesome displays to intimidate. Executions, torture, and the desecration of sacred sites, especially Christian ones, were not just acts of barbarity, they were deliberate messages. They told the enemy, "We are merciless. Your gods cannot protect you, resistance is futile. The blood eagle, whether historically accurate or not, served as a potent symbol of this terrifying reputation. Disinformation and fear-mongering. While difficult to document, it's reasonable to assume that Vikings spread rumors and exaggerated their own strength, or the ferocity of their gods, to further demoralize their opponents. Battle cries and berserkers. The infamous berserkers, warriors who reportedly entered a trance-like fury in battle, were a terrifying psychological weapon. Their apparent imperviousness to pain and their uncontrolled rage would have been profoundly unsettling to any opponent. The loud, intimidating battle cries and horn blasts before a charge were also designed to instill fear and disorient the enemy. These weapons are never heard of in the traditional sense because they are intangible or leave no physical trace. They are not artifacts to be unearthed, but rather strategies and psychological tactics. However, their impact on the outcome of battles and the subjugation of populations was immense. They highlight a crucial aspect of Viking warfare. It wasn't just about superior arms or individual bravery. It was about a holistic, ruthless approach that exploited every possible advantage, including the enemy's fear and the insidious power of unseen threats. The use of poison and psychological warfare tools demonstrates that the Vikings were not just fierce warriors, but cunning strategists who understood the power of the mind as much as the might of the sword, making these some of their deadliest, yet most overlooked instruments of conquest. Let's delve into another crucial, yet frequently ignored, aspect of Viking Age combat: the environment and terrain as a weapon. This isn't about improvised tools, but about the strategic exploitation of the natural world itself to gain a decisive advantage. The Vikings were intimately connected to their environment, and their understanding of land and sea was not just for navigation and settlement, but for warfare. The deadliness of the environment as a weapon lies in its ability to amplify the Vikings' strengths while negating their enemies' advantages, often without direct engagement. This was a form of passive lethality, yet incredibly effective. Consider naval ambush points. The Vikings were masters of their longships, which were shallow-drafted and highly maneuverable. They could navigate narrow fjords, shallow rivers, and hidden coves that larger, heavier enemy vessels could not. This allowed them to set up devastating naval ambushes. Imagine an unsuspecting enemy fleet sailing through a narrow channel, only to be suddenly attacked from concealed coves by multiple longships. The confined space, the element of surprise, and the inability of larger ships to maneuver effectively turned the environment into a killing zone. The jagged rocks and treacherous currents of a coastline could become natural defenses, protecting Viking bases and making direct assault by sea incredibly perilous for an unfamiliar enemy. On land, the Vikings were equally adept at using dense forests and swamps. Forests provided perfect cover for ambushes. Warriors could hide among the trees, launching surprise attacks on marching columns, then melting back into the woods before a counterattack could be organized. The uneven terrain, limited visibility, and difficulty of maintaining formation in a dense forest would severely hamper heavily armored opponents, making them vulnerable to swift, agile Viking raiders. Swamps and bogs. These were particularly deadly. Heavy cavalry or infantry, bogged down in treacherous terrain, would become easy targets. Their movement would be severely restricted, their armor a liability, and their formations broken. The Vikings, often lighter armored and more familiar with such terrain, could move with relative ease, picking off trapped enemies with spears, bows, or throwing axes. Many bog bodies from the Iron Age and later periods attest to the dangers of these environments, whether accidental or intentional. The weather itself, as touched upon earlier, was a weapon. The harsh northern climate, with its sudden storms, freezing temperatures, and heavy fogs, could be devastating to armies unfamiliar with it. Vikings, hardened by their environment, could operate effectively in conditions that would cripple their enemies. A sudden blizzard could isolate and decimate an invading force, allowing the Vikings to pick off survivors. Fog could provide cover for surprise attacks or enable longships to slip past patrols undetected. Even the lack of resources in a given area could be weaponized. By withdrawing into desolate regions, the Vikings could deny their enemies supplies, forcing them to overextend their lines, forage for food, making them vulnerable to ambush or retreat. This scorched earth tactic, or simply exploiting naturally barren lands, was a form of passive resistance that could wear down even a numerically superior foe. The reason the environment as a weapon is never heard of in popular Viking narratives is that it's not a tangible object. It doesn't appear in museum displays or heroic sagas as a named weapon. Yet, it was arguably one of the most significant factors in Viking military success. Their intimate knowledge of their surroundings, their ability to navigate and exploit natural features, and their resilience in harsh conditions gave them a profound strategic advantage. It reminds us that Viking warfare was not just about the strength of their arms, but the cunning of their minds and their deep connection to the natural world, making the very land and sea they inhabited their most potent, and often unseen, weapon. Let's now turn our attention to a weapon that is universally recognized, yet its specific, deadly application and design within the Viking context are often overlooked: the knife, or nifr. While the seax has been discussed as a large fighting knife, the smaller, more ubiquitous knives carried by virtually every Viking person were also incredibly deadly, often used in ways that are rarely highlighted. The nifr was an essential everyday tool. Every Viking, man, woman, and child would have carried one. It was used for everything from eating, preparing food, cutting rope, carving wood, repairing tools, and countless other daily tasks. These knives varied in size but typically had a single edge and a sturdy construction, designed for hard work. They were often made from good quality iron or steel, with handles of wood, bone, or antler. The deadliness of these smaller knives lies in their ubiquity, concealability, and role in desperate, close-quarters combat. Always present, unlike swords or large axes, which might be left behind or dropped in battle, a small knife was almost always at hand, tucked into a belt or pouch. This made it the ultimate last resort weapon. Concealability. A small knife could be easily hidden, making it ideal for surprise attacks, assassinations, or for use by captives attempting to escape. A hidden blade could turn the tide of a personal struggle in an instant. Intimate, brutal combat. In the chaos of a melee or a sudden ambush, a small knife could be drawn quickly and used for rapid, brutal thrusts or slashes. It was a weapon for infighting, for targeting vulnerable points like the neck, groin, armpits, or eyes. These were not weapons for grand, sweeping gestures, but for quick, decisive, and often fatal strikes in close proximity. Finishing blows. After an opponent had been wounded by a larger weapon or knocked to the ground, a knife was often used to deliver a quick, fatal finishing blow. This was a practical necessity in battle, ensuring an enemy was truly incapacitated and wouldn't rise again. Hostage situations. In the brutal world of Viking raids, captives were common. A small, concealed knife could be a tool for escape, or a weapon for a desperate act of defiance. Archaeological finds of smaller knives are abundant across Viking Age sites. They are found in graves, settlements, and hoards, testament to their everyday importance. While not always described as weapons in sagas, their presence in such a violent society means their potential for lethal use would have been universally understood. The reason these knives are never heard of as deadliest weapons is precisely because of their commonality. They lack the heroic narrative of a sword or the raw power of an axe. They are too mundane, too everyday. Yet, it is this very ordinariness that made them so deadly. Every Viking knew how to use a knife, and every Viking knew the damage it could inflict. Imagine a warrior, disarmed and grappling on the ground with an opponent, suddenly pulling a hidden knife and ending the fight with a swift, brutal thrust. Or a captured thrall, seizing an opportunity, using a kitchen knife to overpower a guard. These are the unglamorous, often desperate, but undeniably lethal scenarios where the common niffer would have proven itself to be a truly deadly instrument. It represents the gritty, pragmatic reality of Viking life and death, where even the most basic tool could become a weapon of ultimate consequence. We continue our exploration by examining another set of deadliest weapons you've never heard of, which are less about individual implements and more about collective strategy and specialized unit tactics. The Vikings were not just individual warriors. They were highly effective fighting units, and their tactical formations and specialized roles were often what made them so deadly, far beyond the sum of their individual weapons. One of the most iconic, yet often misunderstood collective weapons was the shield wall, or Eskejaldborg. While the individual shield and its boss have been discussed, the shield wall itself was a formidable living weapon. It wasn't just a defensive formation. It was a mobile, offensive block of human force. Impenetrable defense. Locked shields, often overlapping, presented a near-impenetrable barrier to enemy attacks, protecting the warriors behind them. This allowed the Vikings to withstand charges and volleys of projectiles. Offensive push. The shield wall could advance, pushing and grinding against an enemy formation. The sheer physical force of dozens or hundreds of warriors pushing in unison, combined with the weight of their shields, could break enemy lines, creating openings for their melee weapons. This was a brutal, attritional form of combat, where endurance and discipline were paramount. Internal projection. Warriors within the shield wall could thrust spears and axes over or under their own shields, or into gaps in the enemy's shield wall, inflicting damage while remaining largely protected. This made the shield wall a porcupine of death, bristling with offensive capability. Another often overlooked tactical weapon was the wedge formation, or svinfylking boar's snout. This was a specialized assault formation, designed to punch through enemy lines. A tight, triangular formation of heavily armed warriors would charge, using their combined momentum and concentrated force to cleave a path through a shield wall or a massed enemy. The warriors at the point of the wedge were often the most heavily armed and armored, acting as a living battering ram. This was a high-risk, high-reward tactic that, when successful, could shatter enemy morale and formations, turning a stalemate into a rout. The Vikings also employed specialized roles within their warbands that functioned as weapons in their own right. Berserkers and Ulfheithnar. As mentioned, these frenzied warriors, whether fueled by drugs, psychological conditioning, or sheer willpower, were a psychological weapon. Their apparent imperviousness to pain and their uncontrolled rage were designed to terrify and demoralize opponents. They often led charges, breaking the enemy's resolve. Standard bearers and champions. While not wielding unique weapons, these individuals were critical for morale and cohesion. The loss of a standard bearer or a famous champion could be a devastating blow to an army's fighting spirit. Their very presence was a psychological weapon, inspiring their own and intimidating the enemy. Skirmishers and scouts. These lighter-armed warriors, often equipped with bows, slings, and javelins, were crucial for gathering intelligence, harassing enemy flanks, and drawing out opponents. Their ability to operate independently and inflict damage from a distance was a vital weapon in the overall tactical plan. These collective strategies and specialized units are never heard of as deadliest weapons in the same way as individual swords or axes, because they are intangible, abstract concepts rather than physical objects. Yet, their impact on the outcome of Viking Age battles was arguably more profound than any single blade. They represent the sophisticated understanding of warfare that the Vikings possessed, an understanding that combined individual prowess with disciplined collective action, cunning strategy, and a ruthless exploitation of every possible advantage. The shield wall, the wedge formation, the terrifying berserker charge, the coordinated ambush, these were the true engines of Viking conquest. They transformed individual warriors, however skilled, into an unstoppable force. They highlight that the deadliest Viking weapons were not always those forged in fire, but those forged in the minds of their chieftains and honed through brutal experience on countless battlefields. These collective tactics, often overlooked in favor of individual heroism, were the ultimate expression of Viking military might, making them truly the deadliest, yet most unsung, weapons in their formidable arsenal. As we bring our journey to a close, we hope to have illuminated a side of Viking warfare that extends far beyond the popular imagery of axes and swords. We've delved into the pragmatic, the cunning, and the truly brutal aspects of their arsenal, uncovering the deadliest Viking weapons you've never heard of. From the ubiquitous and versatile spear, the constant companion seaxes, and the surprisingly potent bow and arrow, to the humble yet devastating sling and the ever-present hand axe, we've seen how the Vikings optimized every tool for combat. We've explored how the shield boss transformed a defensive item into an offensive bludgeon, and how the spear axe offered a unique blend of reach and cutting power. Beyond these tangible implements, we've ventured into the realm of the truly insidious, the improvisational spirit that turned anything and everything into a weapon, the strategic use of traps and environmental modifications, the chilling power of ritual blades and psychological warfare, and the raw, unrefined lethality of stone implements. Finally, we've recognized that some of their most potent weapons were not objects at all, but rather their collective strategies: the unbreakable shield wall, the piercing wedge formation, and the specialized roles within their warbands. The Vikings were not just brute force warriors. They were innovators, adapters, and ruthless pragmatists. They understood that victory came not just from the sharpest blade, but from the keenest mind, the most disciplined formation, and the unwavering will to survive and conquer. Their true legacy lies not just in the iconic weapons we remember, but in the vast, varied, and often overlooked arsenal that truly defined their terrifying effectiveness. They remind us that history's shadows often conceal the most fascinating, and indeed, the deadliest truths. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the forgotten edges of history. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Viking warfare, remember to like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and most importantly, subscribe to Beyond Midnight for more journeys into the untold stories and hidden depths of our world. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.